David Harlow's calloused hands trembled as he pried open the rusted metal hatch hidden beneath the lighthouse's crumbling foundation. The beam of his flashlight cut through decades of darkness, illuminating rows upon rows of gold bars stamped with Nazi insignia. $145 million worth of forgotten treasure lay before this struggling single father who'd been mocked by an entire town for inheriting what they called a worthless pile of stones. But as the golden gleam reflected in his tear-filled eyes, David realized that sometimes the things others laugh at hold the greatest secrets of all. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning fog clung to Grayport's weathered docks like a shroud of disappointment, much like the cloud that had settled over David Harlow's life 3 months earlier. At 34, his once bright eyes now carried the weight of sleepless nights and unpaid bills, the consequence of raising 9-year-old Emily alone since his wife Sarah's sudden death from cancer 2 years prior. The insurance money had long since evaporated into medical bills and funeral expenses, leaving father and daughter scraping by in their cramped apartment above Murphy's hardware store, where David worked for barely came above minimum wage. The certified letter had arrived on a Tuesday that felt no different from the hundreds of gray Tuesdays that had preceded it. Emily was at school, her backpack held together with duct tape, and her shoes developing holes that David pretended not to notice. The envelope bore the letterhead of Pemberton, Walsh & Associates, attorneys at law, and David's first instinct was panic, assuming it was another creditor threatening legal action. Instead, he found himself staring at words that seemed impossible. He had inherited property from his late uncle Raymond Harlow, a man David remembered only as the eccentric relative who sent Christmas cards with lighthouse pictures and smelled perpetually of salt water and bay. Disappointment. Uncle Raymond had died alone in a nursing home in Portland, and according to the letter, David was his sole heir. The inheritance consisted of a lighthouse situated on a rocky outcropping 3 miles north of Grayport, along with the small plot of land it sat upon. David's initial surge of hope crashed like waves against rocks when he read the property assessment. The lighthouse was condemned, structurally unsound, and considered a public hazard by the county. The estimated value was listed as negative $15,000, accounting for the cost of demolition that would eventually be required. That evening, after Emily had fallen asleep clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, David drove his sputtering Honda Civic along the winding coastal road to see his inheritance. The lighthouse stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its white paint peeling away in long strips that fluttered in the ocean breeze like surrender flags. The structure leaned slightly seaward, as if the relentless Atlantic winds had spent decades trying to push it into the churning waters below. Broken windows gaped like hollow eyes, and the lamp room at the top had partially collapsed, leaving twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. David sat in his car for nearly an hour, listening to the waves crash against the base of the outcropping and wondering if this was some cosmic joke. He thought about Sarah, about how she would have found something beautiful in this desolate scene, some metaphor about weathering storms or standing firm against adversity. But Sarah was gone, and David felt nothing but the crushing weight of another burden he couldn't afford to carry. The next morning brought the first wave of mockery from his neighbors and coworkers. Murphy, his boss at the hardware store, couldn't contain his laughter when David mentioned the inheritance. Crazy Raymond's lighthouse? Murphy wheezed between chuckles. That death trap should have been torn down 20 years ago. I hope you've got good insurance, Harlow, because when that thing finally falls over, you'll be liable for whatever it crushes. The jokes followed David everywhere he went in the small town. At the grocery store, cashier Helen Morrison smirked as she rang up his discount brand cereal and remarked, "I hear you're moving up in the world, David. From apartment living to lighthouse keeping. Next thing you know, you'll be talking to seagulls like your uncle did." The other customers in line snickered, and David felt heat rise in his cheeks as he fumbled for his food stamps. Emily took the news of their potential move with the resilience that children often display in the face of uncertainty. She had grown accustomed to instability, to making do with less, to watching her father's shoulders sag under invisible weights. When David explained that they might have to live in the lighthouse, at least temporarily, she simply asked if she could have the room at the top so she could see the ocean. Her innocent acceptance only made David's sense of failure more acute. The town's mockery intensified when word spread that David was actually considering moving into the Lighthouse. At Sal's diner, where David occasionally treated Emily to a shared plate of pancakes, the whispers followed them to their booth. "Poor kid's going to grow up thinking that pile of rocks is normal," one patron murmured to another. "Harlow's lost his mind, trying to make that place livable. He'll end up like crazy Raymond, talking to ghosts and collecting driftwood." The comparison to Uncle Raymond stunned more than David cared to admit. He remembered the man vaguely from childhood visits, always carrying the smell of the sea and speaking in cryptic phrases about keeping the light burning and protecting what's hidden beneath. As a child, David had found his uncle fascinating, but as an adult facing eviction from their apartment, Uncle Raymond's legacy felt more like a curse than a blessing. Financial necessity eventually made the decision for them. When Murphy reluctantly informed David that business was slow and he could only afford to keep him on part-time, the writing was on the wall. The rent on their apartment was already 2 months behind, and their landlord, Mrs. Kowalski, had begun making pointed comments about reliable tenants and difficult decisions. The Lighthouse, dangerous and mocked though it might be, represented their only option for shelter. David spent his last full paycheck on basic supplies: a generator, some tarps, battery-powered lanterns, and enough canned food to last them a few weeks. The hardware store's inventory provided most of what he needed at cost, Murphy's small concession to guilt over the reduced hours. David also borrowed a truck from his neighbor Pete, who shook his head sadly while handing over the keys. "You sure about this, Dave? That place has been empty for 15 years for good reason. The foundation's probably shot, and those winter storms are going to be brutal out there." Moving day arrived with a slate-gray sky that threatened rain. David and Emily loaded their meager possessions into Pete's borrowed truck, their entire life fitting easily into the vehicle's bed. Emily carried her stuffed rabbit and a small suitcase of clothes, while David managed the heavier items, his toolbox, Sarah's photo albums, and a few pieces of furniture they couldn't bear to leave behind. Mrs. Kowalski watched from her window as they loaded up, her expression a mixture of relief and pity. The drive to the Lighthouse felt like a journey into exile. Emily pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Grayport give way to the wilder coastline beyond the town limits. The road grew narrower and more rutted as they approached the Lighthouse, and David's Honda Civic, following behind the truck, struggled with the rough terrain. When they finally reached the end of the road, David parked both vehicles and stared at their new home with a mixture of dread and determination. The Lighthouse looked even worse up close than it had from a distance. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the wooden stairs leading to the upper levels were warped and rotted in places. David tested each step carefully as he and Emily explored their new home, his heart sinking with every creaking board and crumbling piece of plaster. The main floor was a single circular room that had once served as the lighthouse keeper's living quarters, but now it was filled with debris, broken glass, and the accumulated filth of years of neglect. Emily, however, saw possibilities where David saw problems. She declared the curved walls like living inside a castle tower and immediately began planning where to put her bed and her small collection of books. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and despite his reservations, David found himself beginning to see the space through her eyes. With some cleaning and basic repairs, the main floor could become livable, cozy even. Their first night in the Lighthouse was an adventure that David would later look back on with something approaching fondness, though at the time, it felt like a disaster. The generator worked, providing enough power for lights and Emily's small electric heater, but the sound of the wind through the broken windows was constant and unsettling. Emily had claimed the second floor as her bedroom, despite the fact that half the windows were boarded up and the other half were cracked. David made do with a sleeping bag on the main floor, close to the generator in case it needed attention during the night. The sound of the waves was overwhelming at first, a constant crash and hiss that seemed to shake the entire structure. David lay awake listening to the rhythm of the ocean and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Emily, however, fell asleep quickly, apparently lulled by the same sounds that kept her father staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, the wind picked up, and David heard new sounds: rattling shutters, whistling air through gaps in the stone, and an occasional groan from the structure itself as it swayed slightly in the gusts. Morning brought their first real challenge. The generator had run out of fuel during the night, and the lighthouse was bitterly cold. David discovered that the building's original heating system, a wood-burning stove connected to a chimney that ran up through the center of the structure, was not only intact but potentially functional. Emily helped him clear debris from the firebox while he inspected the chimney and flue. To his surprise and relief, the system appeared sound, and soon they had their first real fire crackling in the lighthouse since Uncle Raymond's time. The warmth transformed the space, and with it came David's first glimmer of hope that this arrangement might actually work. Emily toasted bread over the open fire, declaring it better than their old electric toaster, and David found that the curved walls and high ceiling created an unexpectedly cozy atmosphere once the chill was driven out. They spent the morning unpacking and organizing, turning the circular room into something resembling a home. The town's reaction to their move was swift and predictable. By the afternoon of their second day, curious locals had begun driving out to the lighthouse to gawk at the crazy Harlows who had actually taken up residence in the condemned structure. David could see cars stopping on the main road, their occupants pointing and taking pictures with their phones. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the endless list of repairs that needed his attention. Emily, however, seemed to thrive on the attention. She had always been a confident child, but living in the lighthouse seemed to bring out a new side of her personality. When a group of teenagers from town rode their bikes out to see the haunted lighthouse, Emily emerged from the building like a tiny tour guide, proudly showing them around the main floor and explaining their improvements. David watched from the window as his daughter charmed the visitors with her enthusiasm, and he felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. He didn't want her to become defensive about their living situation, but he also appreciated her resilience. The first major test of David's resolve came during their third week in the lighthouse. A late September storm rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing winds that howled through every gap in the structure and rain that found dozens of leaks in the roof. David spent the night moving buckets and pots to catch drips, while Emily huddled in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. The lighthouse swayed noticeably in the strongest gusts, and David found himself gripping the windowsill and wondering if this would be the storm that finally knocked the structure down. But the lighthouse held, as it had for nearly a century before them. In the morning, David emerged to find that while several shutters had been torn away and a section of the lamp room's remaining glass had shattered, the core structure was intact. The experience taught him something important about the building. It might look fragile and neglected, but there was strength in its bones that casual observers couldn't see. This realization motivated David to begin making serious repairs rather than just temporary fixes. Using his employee discount at Murphy's Hardware, he began purchasing materials for more substantial improvements. He started with the windows, replacing broken panes and weather-stripping gaps to reduce the constant drafts. Emily helped by organizing his tools and fetching materials, her small size allowing her to crawl into spaces that David couldn't reach. The work was slow and often frustrating. David's carpentry skills were basic, learned through necessity rather than training, and he made plenty of mistakes. But gradually, the lighthouse began to look less like a ruin and more like a home. He repaired the stairs to the upper levels, replaced rotted floorboards, and even managed to get the plumbing functioning again, though the water pressure was barely adequate and the pipes groaned ominously whenever someone turned on a faucet. As October progressed, the mockery from town began to evolve into something approaching grudging respect. Murphy, who had initially been dismissive of David's efforts, started offering advice on structural repairs and occasionally threw in extra materials to get rid of old inventory. Other townspeople who drove out to check on their progress began to comment on the improvements rather than just the folly of the endeavor. Emily thrived in her new environment. The isolation that worried David seemed to invigorate her. She spent hours exploring the rocky coastline around the lighthouse, collecting shells and interesting stones, building elaborate sand castles on the small beach that was accessible at low tide. Her homework was always completed by lamplight at the kitchen table David had built from driftwood and scrap lumber, and her grades actually improved from their time in town. The lighthouse also sparked Emily's imagination in ways that their cramped apartment never had. She began writing stories about shipwrecks and treasure hunters, illustrating them with drawings of the lighthouse standing proud against stormy skies. David found these stories tucked into her school folders and realized that his daughter was not just adapting to their new life. She was embracing it in a way that humbled and inspired him. November brought the first serious winter weather, and with it, a new understanding of why Uncle Raymond had been considered eccentric. The lighthouse, perched on its rocky outcropping, was exposed to the full fury of North Atlantic storms in a way that no mainland building could replicate. The wind was constant, varying only in intensity, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below became the soundtrack to their daily lives. David had prepared as well as he could, stockpiling firewood and canned goods, checking and rechecking the generator and backup supplies. He had also installed a two-way radio system, partially to stay in contact with the outside world during severe weather, but mainly to reassure himself that they weren't completely cut off from civilization. Emily loved the radio, spending hours listening to weather reports and occasionally managing to pick up distant conversations from passing ships. The first blizzard of the season was a revelation. Snow driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds created whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see beyond the lighthouse's windows. David and Emily huddled around their wood stove, playing board games and reading by lamplight while the storm raged outside. The lighthouse rocked and groaned like a ship at sea, but it held firm against the assault. During a brief lull in the storm, David ventured outside to check for damage and was amazed by what he found. The lighthouse, covered in a thick coating of ice and snow, looked like something from a fairy tale. More importantly, it had suffered no significant damage, despite the severity of the weather. Standing in the howling wind, looking up at the structure that sheltered his daughter, David felt a profound connection to Uncle Raymond and all the lighthouse keepers who had come before him. As winter deepened, David's relationship with the lighthouse evolved from mere cohabitation to something approaching partnership. He learned to read its moods, to understand when the wind patterns meant a storm was approaching, to recognize which creaks and groans were normal settling and which might indicate a problem. The building seemed to respond to his care, becoming more solid and reliable as he continued his repairs and improvements. Emily's relationship with their home was even more profound. She had claimed the entire lighthouse as her domain, knowing every stair and corner, every view from every window. She could predict the tides by the sound of the waves, and had memorized the schedules of the local fishing boats that passed their outcropping each morning and evening. David sometimes found her standing at the windows of the lamp room, her small figure silhouetted against the gray winter sky, and wondered what she was thinking about during these quiet moments. The turning point in their lighthouse life came during a particularly brutal storm in late January. David had been working on reinforcing the foundation, a massive undertaking that required him to dig around the base of the structure and assess the condition of the stonework. The job was backbreaking and often dangerous, especially when the tide was high and waves crashed over the rocks where he was working. On this particular day, Emily was at school, and David had taken advantage of the low tide to work on a section of foundation on the seaward side of the lighthouse. The storm had been building all morning, but David was determined to finish installing a support beam before the weather became too severe to work safely. He was chiseling away mortar from between two large foundation stones when his crowbar slipped and struck the stone with unusual force. Instead of the solid dunk he expected, David heard a hollow ringing sound. He struck the stone again, more deliberately this time, and confirmed his suspicion. There was an empty space behind this section of the foundation. His first thought was that erosion had created a cavity that might threaten the stability of the lighthouse, but as he examined the stonework more closely, he realized that the hollow space was intentional. The stones in this section were arranged differently from the rest of the foundation, fitted together with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than simple construction. David found the edges of what appeared to be a deliberately concealed opening, hidden behind stones that had been carefully mortared into place to blend seamlessly with the surrounding foundation. Working feverishly as the storm approached, David managed to loosen several of the concealing stones and reveal what lay beneath. A metal hatch, green with corrosion and sealed with rust, but unmistakably man-made. The hatch was about 3 feet square and appeared to be made of heavy steel. There was no handle or obvious opening mechanism, but David could see the outline of hinges on one side and what might be a locking mechanism on the other. The first drops of rain began to fall as David cleared away the last of the concealing stones and debris. The approaching storm made it impossible to investigate further, but the discovery consumed his thoughts as he hurried back inside to prepare for the weather. He said nothing to Emily when she returned from school that afternoon, not wanting to raise her hopes in case the hatch proved to be nothing more than an old storage compartment or utility access. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days during which David could think of little besides the mysterious hatch hidden in the lighthouse's foundation. He researched the building's history at the town library during a brief break in the weather, but found only basic construction records and a few mentions of Uncle Raymond's eccentricities. There was nothing about hidden compartments or concealed spaces, though David did discover that the lighthouse had been built in 1928 during the height of Prohibition. This historical context sparked David's imagination. Prohibition had made criminals out of ordinary citizens and created a thriving black market in illegal alcohol. Coastal Maine, with its rocky shores and secluded coves, had been a smuggler's paradise during those years. Could Uncle Raymond, or perhaps the lighthouse's original keeper, have been involved in rum running? Could the hidden hatch conceal evidence of those long-ago crimes? When the storm finally passed, David waited until Emily was safely at school before returning to the foundation with a proper toolkit. The hatch was even more corroded than he had initially realized, and it took him nearly 2 hours of careful work with penetrating oil and wire brushes to free the locking mechanism. When the latch finally gave way with a rusty screech, David's hands were shaking with anticipation and exhaustion. The hatch opened to reveal a narrow stone-lined shaft that descended into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. A metal ladder, spotted with rust but apparently still solid, was bolted to one wall of the shaft. The air that rose from the opening was stale and cold, carrying scents of salt water and something else, something that David couldn't immediately identify. David's practical side urged caution. The shaft could be filled with toxic gases, or the ladder might be too corroded to support his weight, or the space below might be flooded. But his curiosity was stronger than his caution, and after testing the first few rungs of the ladder, he began his descent into the hidden depths beneath the lighthouse. The shaft was about 15 feet deep, ending in a chamber that had been carved from the living rock of the outcropping. David's flashlight beam revealed a space about the size of a large bedroom, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The walls were lined with wooden shelving, most of which had collapsed or rotted away over the decades. But what caught David's attention was not the ruined furniture. The chamber was filled with wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked from floor to ceiling along 3 of the 4 walls. Most of the crates were plain pine boxes of various sizes, but some bore stenciled markings in what appeared to be German. David approached the nearest stack with growing excitement, his flashlight beam dancing across the faded lettering on the wooden surfaces. The first crate he examined was partially collapsed. Its contents spilled across the stone floor. Bottles of what had once been wine or liquor, now reduced to broken glass and evaporated alcohol. But the second crate, though water-damaged and warped, was still intact. David pried off the lid with his crowbar and found himself staring at something that made his heart race. Neat rows of gold bars, each about the size of a paperback book, tarnished black with age, but unmistakably BS. Precious. David lifted one of the bars from the crate, surprised by its weight and the way his flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by its dark surface. There were markings stamped into the metal, symbols and text that he couldn't read but that sent a chill down his spine. Even tarnished and corroded, the bar was obviously valuable, and there were at least 20 more in just this one crate. Moving methodically through the chamber, David opened crate after crate, finding more gold bars, some silver coins, bundles of what appeared to be old currency, and other items he couldn't immediately identify. Some crates contained only rotted fabric or rusted metal, victims of the chamber's dampness, but others had preserved their contents remarkably well. David estimated that there were at least 50 crates in the chamber, though many were stacked too high for him to reach without proper equipment. The implications of his discovery were staggering. This wasn't just a smuggler's cache from Prohibition. The German markings and the style of the gold bars suggested something far more significant. As David examined more of the items by flashlight, he began to suspect that he had stumbled upon a treasure trove that dated from World War II, possibly gold and valuables looted by the Nazis and hidden away for reasons he could only guess at. The weight of this discovery was almost crushing. David sat on one of the lower crates, surrounded by what might be millions of dollars in precious metals and artifacts, and tried to process what this meant for him and Emily. Their days of struggling to pay for groceries and worrying about eviction were over, but the magnitude of the find also brought new concerns. How had this treasure ended up beneath the lighthouse? Was it legally his, or would the government claim it? How could he convert these assets into usable money without attracting unwanted attention? David spent the rest of the day cataloging what he could see and taking photos with his phone, though the poor lighting made detailed documentation difficult. He also began researching the history of Nazi gold and World War II treasure recoveries, trying to understand the legal and practical implications of his find. What he learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Such discoveries were not uncommon, but they often resulted in lengthy legal battles and government seizures. That evening, David struggled to maintain a normal facade for Emily's benefit. She chattered about her day at school while they shared a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, unaware that her father had just discovered enough wealth to transform their lives beyond recognition. David found himself looking at their humble lighthouse home with new eyes, seeing it not as a burden or a symbol of their reduced circumstances, but as the guardian of an incredible secret that Uncle Raymond had somehow kept for decades. The next few days were a blur of clandestine research and careful planning. David took vacation time from his part-time job at the hardware store, telling Murphy that he needed to make some urgent repairs before the next big storm. Instead, he spent his time learning everything he could about treasure recovery, precious metals markets, and the legal frameworks that govern such discoveries. The more David researched, the more convinced he became that the treasure was indeed Nazi gold, probably looted from European banks and private collections during the war. Such caches had been discovered all over the world in the decades since 1945, hidden by fleeing Nazi officials or their collaborators. How it had ended up beneath a Maine lighthouse was a mystery. Though David suspected that Uncle Raymond's cryptic comments about protecting what's hidden beneath suggested he had known about the treasure all along, David's biggest concern was ensuring that he could claim the treasure legally and convert it into usable wealth without losing everything to taxes or government seizures. He consulted with a lawyer in Portland, presenting his situation hypothetically as a what-if scenario. The attorney's advice was cautious but encouraging. Such discoveries were generally considered the property of the landowner, but the process of legally establishing ownership and converting the assets could be complex and expensive. Armed with this knowledge, David began the delicate process of documenting and securing his find. He invested in proper lighting and photography equipment, creating detailed inventories of each crate and its contents. He also consulted with precious metals dealers, again approaching the subject hypothetically, to understand the current market values for gold and silver. The numbers were staggering. Even accounting for the costs of authentication, legal fees, and taxes, David estimated that the treasure was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $145 million. The figure was so large as to be almost meaningless. It represented wealth beyond anything David had ever imagined possessing. But perhaps more important than the monetary value was what the discovery meant for Emily's future. David had spent 2 years worrying about his ability to provide for his daughter, to give her the opportunities and security that every parent wanted for their child. Now, suddenly, he could ensure that Emily would never want for anything, that she could attend the best schools, pursue any career that interested her, and have the freedom to make choices based on passion rather than financial necessity. The transformation of David's relationship with the town of Grayport began even before he revealed his discovery. Word had spread that he was making significant improvements to the lighthouse, and several townspeople had driven out to see the progress for themselves. What they found was remarkable. The structure that had been a local eyesore for decades was beginning to look like a real home, even something approaching a showpiece. David had used his new knowledge of the lighthouse's hidden value to justify investing more heavily in repairs and improvements. He hired professional contractors for some of the more complex work, paying cash and explaining that he had received a small inheritance from another relative. The improvements were dramatic, new windows throughout the structure, a completely rebuilt stairway to the upper levels, modern insulation and electrical systems, and even the beginnings of a restored lamp room at the top of WWII-era. The lighthouse. Emily was thrilled with the improvements, especially the restoration of the lamp room. David had installed a powerful LED light system that could be seen for miles along the coast, and Emily delighted in turning it on each evening as sunset approached. The sight of the lighthouse beam cutting through the darkness for the first time in decades had drawn attention from passing ships and coastal communities, transforming the structure from a local curiosity into a genuine enero. Landmark. The town's attitude toward the Harlows began to shift as well. Murphy, David's boss at the hardware store, started bragging to customers about his employees' remarkable restoration project. "That Harlow boy's got vision," he would tell anyone who would listen. "Took that old wreck and turned it into something special. Takes real character to see the potential in something everyone else has written off." Similar transformations occurred throughout Grayport. Helen Morrison at the grocery store stopped making snide comments about David's food stamp usage and started asking genuine questions about the lighthouse restoration. The teenagers who had once ridden their bikes out to gawk at the crazy Harlows now brought their friends to see the amazing transformation of the old lighthouse. Emily, always sensitive to social currents, noticed the change immediately. She began inviting classmates to visit the lighthouse, proudly showing off their unique home and her father's craftsmanship. David watched these interactions with a mixture of pride and amusement, remembering how just a few months earlier, Emily had been the object of pity and ridicule as the daughter of the man foolish enough to live in a condemned lighthouse. The day David finally revealed his discovery was one of those perfect May mornings that make residents forget about the harsh winters and endless gray skies. The sun was brilliant, the ocean calm, and the lighthouse stood against the blue sky like something from a postcard. Emily had gone to school, chattering about a field trip to the Maritime Museum, leaving David alone with his secret for what he had decided would be the last time. David had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting with lawyers, accountants, and precious metals experts to ensure that he handled the discovery correctly from a legal standpoint. He had also hired a professional security company to discreetly monitor the lighthouse and protect the treasure during the transition period. Everything was in place for what would either be the beginning of a new life or the start of a very complicated legal battle. The first call David made was to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Portland. He had learned that discoveries of potential Nazi treasure were required to be reported to federal authorities, both for legal and historical reasons. The agent who took his call was initially skeptical, David's story sounding like the kind of fantasy that law enforcement officers heard regularly from attention seekers and treasure hunters. But David's calm, methodical presentation of the facts, backed up by detailed photographs and documentation, quickly convinced the agent that this was a legitimate discovery that required serious attention. Within hours, a team of federal investigators was on its way to Grayport, along with experts from the State Department and historians from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. The arrival of multiple federal vehicles at the lighthouse created quite a stir in Grayport. Word spread quickly through the small town that something significant was happening at the old lighthouse, and by mid-afternoon, dozens of curious locals had gathered on the main road to watch the proceedings. David found himself at the center of a media circus that he had neither expected nor wanted. The federal investigation confirmed David's suspicions about the treasure's origins. The gold bars bore Nazi insignia and serial numbers that matched historical records of gold looted from banks in occupied Europe. The currency included rare bills from various European countries, some of which had been reported missing from museums and private collections during the war. The total value of the find, according to the government experts, was even higher than David had estimated, approximately $145 million at current precious metals prices. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, but ultimately favorable to David. As the owner of the property where the treasure was discovered, he had legitimate claim to the find, though the process of establishing clear title required months of legal maneuvering. The federal government retained some items of particular historical significance for museum display, but the bulk of the treasure was legally transferred to David's ownership. The transformation of David and Emily's circumstances was immediate and dramatic. David quit his job at the hardware store, though he continued to live in the Lighthouse, while arrangements were made for the conversion of his assets into more conventional investments. He hired financial advisors, established trust funds for Emily's education, and began making plans for their future that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of David's newfound wealth was the reaction of the Grayport community. The same people who had mocked him for inheriting a worthless pile of rocks now treated him with a mixture of awe and respect that bordered on reverence. Murphy, his former boss, couldn't stop talking about how he had always known there was something special about that lighthouse, conveniently forgetting his earlier mockery. Helen Morrison at the grocery store now greeted David like visiting royalty, insisting on personally bagging his groceries and asking detailed questions about his restoration plans for the lighthouse. The teenagers who had once come to gawk now approached David with genuine admiration, asking for advice about construction projects and career choices. Emily handled the dramatic change in their circumstances with the same grace and resilience she had shown throughout their struggles. She continued attending Grayport Elementary, though David had made arrangements for her to attend a prestigious private school in Portland the following year. She still did her homework at the kitchen table David had built from driftwood, though she now had her own laptop and unlimited access to educational resources. The lighthouse itself became a symbol of transformation that extended beyond the Harlow family. David's restoration project, now funded by virtually unlimited resources, turned the structure into a showcase that attracted visitors from across New England. He hired local contractors and craftsmen for much of the work, bringing economic benefits to the entire Grayport community. The completed restoration was a masterpiece that honored the lighthouse's history, while incorporating modern conveniences and safety features. The lamp room was fully functional, its beam visible for 20 miles at sea and serving as a navigational aid for local fishermen and pleasure boaters. The living quarters were luxuriously appointed but retained the rustic charm that Emily loved so much. David also established a foundation dedicated to maritime preservation and education, using a portion of his newfound wealth to support similar restoration projects along the Maine coast. The foundation's headquarters were located in Grayport, bringing jobs and recognition to the small town that had once laughed at the man who inherited a worthless lighthouse. The story of David's discovery attracted national media attention, turning him into something of a celebrity, despite his preference for privacy. He appeared on several television programs and was featured in magazines and newspapers across the country. The lighthouse became a tourist destination, though David carefully controlled access to protect Emily's privacy and their family life. Emily thrived in their transformed circumstances, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about her adaptation was how little she fundamentally changed. She remained the confident, curious child she had always been, though now she had resources to pursue her interests in ways that would have been impossible before. She took sailing lessons, learned to play the piano, and began writing more seriously, inspired by the lighthouse's dramatic history. The mystery of how Nazi treasure had ended up beneath a Maine lighthouse was never fully solved, though historical research provided some clues. Records suggested that Uncle Raymond had purchased the lighthouse from the federal government in 1946, shortly after the war ended. There were also indications that he had served in the Merchant Marine during the war, possibly giving him knowledge of smuggling operations or access to information about hidden Nazi assets. David preferred to think of Uncle Raymond as a guardian rather than a smuggler, someone who had discovered the treasure and kept it safe for decades, waiting for the right person to inherit both the lighthouse and its secrets. The old man's cryptic comments about keeping the light burning and protecting what's hidden beneath took on new meaning in light of the discovery. The revelation of the treasure's existence had an unexpected effect on David's relationship with his late wife's memory. Sarah had always believed that good things came to those who persevered through hardship, that struggles were temporary, but character was permanent. Standing in the restored lighthouse, watching Emily help visiting school groups learn about maritime history, David felt that Sarah would have been proud of how they had weathered their storm and emerged stronger. The legal proceedings surrounding the treasure took nearly a year to complete, during which time David lived in a strange limbo between his old life of financial struggle and his new reality of incredible wealth. He continued to live simply during this period, partly out of caution, and partly because he wanted Emily to understand that their good fortune came with responsibilities. During the legal process, David learned more about the treasure's likely history. Government historians believed that the gold and artifacts had been part of a larger cache hidden by fleeing Nazi officials in the final months of World War II. Several similar discoveries had been made along the eastern seaboard in the decades following the war, suggesting an organized effort to hide stolen wealth in preparation for a post-war escape that never materialized. The specific route by which the treasure reached the main lighthouse remained unclear, but investigators theorized that it had been transported by submarine and hidden during the chaotic final months of the war. Uncle Raymond's role in the story was equally mysterious, though David suspected that his uncle had either discovered the cache by accident during renovation work or had been entrusted with its location by someone else. What mattered more than the historical details was the impact the discovery had on David and Emily's future. When the legal proceedings were finally complete and David had full access to his newfound wealth, he approached his new circumstances with the same methodical care he had brought to restoring the lighthouse. The first priority was Emily's education. David established a substantial trust fund that would ensure she could attend any school or university she chose, pursue any career that interested her, and never face the kind of financial insecurity that had dominated her early childhood. But he was also careful to ensure that Emily understood the value of work and the importance of contributing to society. Emily's response to their changed circumstances was remarkably mature. She had lived through enough hardship to appreciate security, but she had also inherited her father's practical nature and her mother's sense of social responsibility. When David explained that they now had enough money to help other people, Emily immediately began suggesting ways they could make a difference in their community. The Harlow Foundation, established with Emily's input and enthusiastic support, became a model for how sudden wealth could be used to benefit entire communities. The foundation focused on maritime preservation, educational programs, and economic development in small coastal towns like Grayport. David hired local residents whenever possible, creating jobs and opportunities that strengthened the entire region. The lighthouse itself became the foundation's flagship project and a symbol of transformation that extended far beyond David's personal story. Professional architects and historians worked with David to create a restoration that was both historically accurate and practically functional. The result was a structure that served as a working lighthouse, a historical museum, and a family home all at once. Visitors to the lighthouse were struck by the seamless blend of old and new, rustic and refined. The main floor retained its circular layout and stone walls, but now featured modern amenities hidden within period-appropriate furnishings. The upper levels had been converted into a museum, showcasing the lighthouse's history and the broader story of coastal Maine, while the lamp room functioned as both a navigational aid and a dramatic venue for special events. Emily's room, still located on the second floor, as she had originally requested, had been transformed into a young scholar's dream. Built-in bookcases lined the curved walls, filled with volumes on maritime history, marine biology, and creative writing. A window seat with custom cushions provided the perfect spot for reading while watching the ocean, and a small telescope allowed her to observe passing ships and seabirds. The restoration attracted attention from preservation societies and tourism boards throughout New England. Architecture magazines featured the lighthouse as an example of sensitive historical renovation, and travel writers praised it as a unique destination that combined luxury accommodations with authentic historical experience. But David was careful to balance public access with family privacy, ensuring that Emily could still have a normal childhood despite their extraordinary circumstances. The economic impact of David's discovery extended throughout Grayport and the surrounding region. The lighthouse restoration project had employed dozens of local craftsmen and contractors, pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into the local economy. The subsequent tourist traffic brought additional revenue to local businesses, from restaurants and shops to bed and breakfasts and tour operators. Murphy's hardware store experienced a renaissance as visitors sought authentic coastal Maine experiences, and David's restoration project created demand for specialized materials and tools. Murphy himself became something of a local celebrity, regaling customers with stories about how he had always known David was destined for great things, though he was more honest with close friends about his initial buy. Skepticism. Helen Morrison parlayed her connection to the Harlow family into a part-time job as a tour guide, sharing stories about the lighthouse's history and David's remarkable transformation from struggling single father to local hero. Her natural storytelling ability and genuine enthusiasm made her popular with visitors, and she began leading walking tours of Grayport that highlighted the town's maritime heritage. The changes in how people treated David were sometimes uncomfortable for someone who had grown accustomed to being overlooked or pitied. Former neighbors who had barely acknowledged him during his struggles now sought his attention and advice on everything from investment strategies to home renovation projects. David learned to navigate these social dynamics with grace, but he never forgot who had been kind to him during his darkest days. Pete, the neighbor who had loaned David his truck for the move to the lighthouse, found himself the recipient of an unexpected gift. David had the old truck completely restored and returned it in better condition than Pete had ever seen it. Such gestures of gratitude became David's trademark, as he looked for ways to acknowledge the people who had shown him kindness when he had little to offer in return. The media attention surrounding David's story eventually subsided, but the lighthouse remained a popular destination for visitors seeking both historical education and inspiration. David established regular touring schedules that allowed the public to visit the museum portions of the lighthouse while preserving his family's privacy. He also created educational programs for school groups, giving Emily opportunities to share her unique perspective on lighthouse life. Emily's role as an unofficial ambassador for the lighthouse brought out leadership qualities that impressed everyone who met her. She could explain the technical aspects of lighthouse operation to engineering students, share maritime folklore with younger children, and discuss historical preservation with adult visitors, adapting her communication style to each audience with remarkable skill. The girl who had once helped her father arrange furniture in a cold, empty lighthouse now hosted dinner parties for visiting dignitaries and educational experts. But despite the dramatic change in their circumstances, Emily retained the independence and resilience that had characterized her since childhood. She still helped with household chores, still did her homework diligently, and still collected shells on the beach during low tide. David's investment strategy reflected the same careful, long-term thinking he had brought to the lighthouse restoration. Rather than making dramatic lifestyle changes, he focused on building sustainable wealth that would benefit Emily and future generations. He diversified his investments, established charitable foundations, and created business ventures that aligned with his values and interests. One of the most successful of these ventures was a company specializing in historical preservation and restoration. Drawing on his experience with the Lighthouse project, David assembled a team of architects, historians, and craftsmen who could tackle similar projects throughout New England. The company not only generated profits, but also preserved important historical structures that might otherwise have been lost. The transformation of David's public image, from local failure to inspirational success story, brought unexpected opportunities and responsibilities. He was invited to speak at conferences on entrepreneurship, historical preservation, and overcoming adversity. These speaking engagements, while sometimes overwhelming for someone who preferred privacy, provided platforms for promoting causes he cared about. David's message to audiences was always grounded in the lessons he had learned during his struggles and subsequent success. He emphasized the importance of perseverance, the value of seeing potential where others saw only problems, and the responsibility that came with good fortune. His authentic, humble approach to success resonated with audiences who were tired of conventional success stories. The lighthouse's lamp, restored to full functionality with modern LED technology, became a powerful symbol for the entire region. Local fishermen appreciated the navigational aid, while tourists were drawn by the romantic appeal of a working lighthouse. Emily took special pride in the lighting ceremony each evening, a ritual that connected their daily life to the lighthouse's historical purpose. The mystery of Uncle Raymond's role in the treasure's story was partially solved when David discovered a hidden journal during renovation work on the lighthouse's upper levels. The journal, written in Raymond's distinctive handwriting, revealed that he had indeed discovered the treasure cache during renovation work in the 1950s, but had been afraid to report it due to the complex legal and political implications. Raymond's journal entries revealed a man torn between moral obligations and practical concerns. He had researched the treasure's likely origins and understood that it represented stolen wealth from Nazi-occupied Europe, but he had also worried about the legal complications that would arise from reporting such a discovery. His solution had been to serve as a guardian, keeping the treasure safe until circumstances allowed for its proper disposition. The journal also explained Raymond's eccentric behavior in his later years. His cryptic comments about keeping the light burning and protecting what's hidden beneath had been his way of ensuring that someone in the family would eventually discover the truth. His choice to leave the lighthouse to David, whom he barely knew, had been based on careful observation of David's character during family gatherings and his belief that David would handle the discovery responsibly. Reading his uncle's journal gave David a deeper appreciation for the burden Raymond had carried for decades. The old man had lived with knowledge that could have transformed his life, but had chosen to preserve the secret for future generations, rather than pursue personal gain. This revelation reinforced David's determination to use his newfound wealth responsibly and honor his uncle's memory. The completion of the lighthouse restoration marked the end of one chapter in David and Emily's story and the beginning of another. The structure that had once symbolized their desperation and the town's mockery now stood as a testament to the power of perseverance and the unexpected ways that life could change. David had learned that sometimes the things others laughed at, the burdens that seemed impossible to bear, could contain the seeds of extraordinary transformation. Emily's 10th birthday party, held in the restored lamp room with panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean, was a celebration that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Friends from school mingled with visiting dignitaries, local residents shared stories with tourists, and the lighthouse beam swept across waters that had witnessed centuries of human drama and triumph. As David watched his daughter blow out candles on a cake decorated to look like their lighthouse, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The treasure they had discovered was valuable beyond measure, but the real transformation had occurred in the people they had become and the community they had helped to rebuild. The lighthouse continued to serve its original purpose, guiding ships safely through dangerous waters, but it had also become something more, a symbol of hope for anyone facing seemingly impossible circumstances. David's story spread beyond Grayport, inspiring other people to look for opportunity in adversity and to remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places that others have given up on. The final entry in David's own journal, written on the 2nd anniversary of his discovery, captured the essence of their transformation. Emily asked me today if I ever regret inheriting the lighthouse, if I ever wish Uncle Raymond had left us something more conventional. I told her that the lighthouse gave us exactly what we needed, not just the treasure hidden beneath it, but the strength we found in rebuilding it together. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens, and the real treasure is not what we find, but who we become in the searching." End quote. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark waters, as it had for nearly a century, but now it carried new meaning. It was no longer just a navigational aid for passing ships, but a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, or forgotten. David and Emily Harlow had transformed not just their own lives, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when people refused to give up on seemingly hopeless situations. In the end, the $145 million treasure was just the beginning of their story, not its conclusion. The real wealth they had discovered lay in the bonds they had strengthened, the community they had helped rebuild, and the knowledge that sometimes the very things that seem to drag us down are actually lifting us towards something better than we ever imagined possible. The third year after the discovery brought new challenges and opportunities that tested David's commitment to responsible stewardship of his newfound wealth. Emily, now 12 and increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of their circumstances, began asking more complex questions about their obligations to others and the ethical implications of their good fortune. Her inquiries forced David to examine his own values more deeply and consider how their story could serve as a model for others facing similar windfalls. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred during a winter storm that kept them confined to the lighthouse for 3 days. Emily had been reading about income inequality in her social studies class and wanted to understand why they had so much when others had so little. David explained that their wealth was largely accidental, the result of Uncle Raymond's long guardianship, rather than any particular merit on their part, and that this made their responsibility to help others even greater. This conversation led to the expansion of the Harlow Foundation's mission beyond maritime preservation, to include direct assistance for struggling families in coastal communities. David established a program that provided emergency financial assistance, educational scholarships, and small business loans to residents of towns like Grayport who faced economic hardship. The program was administered through local community organizations to ensure that help reached those who needed it most, while preserving the dignity of recipients. Emily insisted on being involved in the foundation's work, despite her youth. She helped review scholarship applications, participated in community meetings, and even convinced David to establish a special fund for children whose parents had died, understanding from personal experience how devastating such losses could be. Her involvement brought a perspective to the foundation's work that surprised and impressed the adults who worked with her. The lighthouse itself continued to evolve as both a family home and a public institution. David commissioned the construction of a separate visitor center that housed the museum exhibits and gift shop, allowing the lighthouse proper to remain their private residence while still accommodating the steady stream of tourists who wanted to learn about their story. The visitor center was designed to complement the lighthouse's architecture while providing modern amenities for educational programs and special events. The success of the lighthouse restoration inspired similar projects throughout Maine and New England. David's preservation company was hired to restore other historic structures, from covered bridges to old mills, each project employing local workers and contributing to regional economic development. The company's reputation for combining historical accuracy with practical functionality made it a leader in the preservation field. One of the most significant projects was the restoration of the Grayport Maritime Museum, a 19th-century customs house that had been abandoned for decades. David's company transformed the building into a world-class facility that told the story of Maine's maritime heritage, from its earliest Native American inhabitants through the Age of Sail to the modern lobster bra industry. The museum became a major tourist attraction that brought thousands of visitors to Grayport each year. Emily's role in these projects evolved as she grew older and more knowledgeable about preservation techniques and historical research. She spent her summers working alongside professional archaeologists and historians, learning techniques for documenting and preserving artifacts. Her youth and enthusiasm made her popular with visiting school groups, and she developed a reputation as one of the most effective educators in the region. The girl who had once collected shells on the beach now led expeditions to document shipwrecks and underwater archaeological sites. She learned to use sophisticated diving equipment and underwater cameras, creating detailed records of submerged historical sites that contributed to academic research and public education. Her work earned recognition from professional organizations and led to invitations to speak at conferences and symposiums. David watched his daughter's development with a mixture of pride and amazement. The confident child who had adapted to lighthouse life was becoming a thoughtful young woman with her own passions and expertise. She had inherited her mother's compassion and her father's determination, but she was also developing her own unique perspective on history, preservation, and social responsibility. The financial management of their wealth required constant attention and expertise that David had never imagined needing. He assembled a team of advisors that included investment managers, tax specialists, legal experts, and philanthropic consultants. The complexity of managing such significant assets while maintaining their commitment to charitable giving and community development required careful planning and regular review. David's investment strategy emphasized long-term growth and social responsibility. He avoided investments in industries that conflicted with his values and sought opportunities that aligned with his commitment to historical preservation and community development. This approach sometimes meant accepting lower returns in exchange for investments that supported causes he believed in, but David considered this a worthwhile trade-off. The lighthouse's role as a navigational aid became increasingly important as marine traffic in the area grew. Commercial fishing vessels, recreational boats, and cruise ships all relied on the lighthouse's beam for safe passage through the rocky waters surrounding Grayport. David took this responsibility seriously, maintaining the light system to the highest standards and coordinating with the Coast Guard to ensure optimal visibility and reliability. The technological aspects of lighthouse operation fascinated Emily, who learned to maintain and repair the sophisticated LED systems and automated controls that kept the light functioning reliably. She understood the physics of light propagation, the importance of proper lens cleaning and alignment, and the backup systems that ensured continuous operation even during power outages. Her technical knowledge impressed visiting engineers and lighthouse enthusiasts. The mystery of the treasure's origins continued to yield new information as historical researchers investigated similar discoveries around the world. David funded research projects at several universities, contributing to scholarly understanding of Nazi looting operations and post-war recovery efforts. These investigations revealed connections between the Grayport treasure and other caches discovered in South America, Africa, and other parts of North America. One particularly significant discovery came when researchers found records suggesting that Uncle Raymond had been contacted by a Holocaust survivor who had information about the treasure's location. The survivor, who had died decades earlier, had apparently been part of a network of people working to recover stolen Jewish assets and return them to rightful owners or appropriate memorial organizations. Uncle Raymond's decision to safeguard the treasure rather than personally profit from it aligned with this mission. This revelation led David to establish a special fund dedicated to Holocaust education and remembrance. Working with organizations like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, David funded educational programs, survivor testimony projects, and research initiatives that used the lighthouse treasure as a starting point for broader discussions about historical memory and moral responsibility. Emily's understanding of their treasure's significance deepened as she learned more about the Holocaust in World War II. She insisted on visiting Holocaust memorial sites during family trips to Europe, and she began incorporating these experiences into her own educational presentations. Her ability to connect the lighthouse story to broader themes of human rights and historical justice impressed audiences and added depth to the educational programs offered at the lighthouse. The economic impact of David's various projects continued to ripple through the region. The restoration company's success led to the establishment of a training program for traditional building crafts, teaching skills like stone masonry, timber framing, and blacksmithing that were essential for authentic Salsay. Historical restoration. The program attracted students from around the world and helped preserve craft traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Local suppliers and contractors benefited enormously from the steady stream of preservation projects managed by David's company. Quarries that specialized in period-appropriate stone found new markets for their products, while craftsmen who had struggled to find work in their traditional specialties suddenly had more commissions than they could handle. The ripple effects included increased property values, new business opportunities, and a general sense of economic optimism that had been missing from the region for decades. The lighthouse's fame as a tourist destination brought challenges as well as opportunities. The number of visitors sometimes overwhelmed Grayport's infrastructure, creating traffic problems and straining local services. David worked with town officials to manage these issues, funding improvements to parking facilities, road maintenance, and public restrooms. He also established a shuttle service that reduced traffic congestion while providing employment for local residents. The balance between public access and private life required constant adjustment. David and Emily loved sharing their story and educating visitors about lighthouse history, but they also needed time and space to live as a normal family. They established clear boundaries about which parts of the lighthouse were open to tourists and which were private, and they hired professional guides to lead tours during peak visitation periods. Emily's education became increasingly specialized as her interests in maritime history and archaeology deepened. David arranged for her to study with private tutors who were experts in their fields, supplementing traditional academic subjects with hands-on experience in historical research and preservation techniques. She spent summers at archaeological field schools and attended specialized camps for young scholars interested in maritime studies. The girl's academic achievements were remarkable, but David was equally proud of her character development. Emily remained humble despite her unique circumstances, treating everyone she met with respect and kindness regardless of their social or economic status. She volunteered at local charities, helped elderly residents with household tasks, and mentored younger students who were interested in history and science. The lighthouse's restoration had become a model for adaptive reuse of historical structures. Architecture schools brought students to study David's approach to balancing historical authenticity with modern functionality. The project was featured in textbooks and professional journals, establishing David as a thought leader in the preservation field, despite his lack of formal training in architecture or historic preservation. The success of the Lighthouse project led to consulting opportunities around the world. David was invited to advise on restoration projects in Europe, South America, and Asia, sharing expertise gained through his hands-on experience with the lighthouse. These international connections broadened his perspective and brought new ideas back to his projects in Maine. Emily often accompanied David on these international trips, gaining exposure to different cultures and historical contexts that enriched her understanding of global maritime heritage. She became fascinated by the similarities and differences between lighthouse designs around the world, developing expertise in comparative lighthouse architecture that impressed professional historians and engineers. The 4th anniversary of the treasure discovery was marked by a major symposium at the Lighthouse on the theme of Hidden Histories and Recovered Heritage. Scholars, museum curators, and preservation specialists from around the world gathered to discuss discoveries like David's and their implications for understanding historical events and cultural heritage. Emily served as one of the youngest presenters, sharing her perspective on growing up with recovered treasure and its impact on community identity. The symposium proceedings were published as a book that included a chapter by Emily titled Living with History, A Young Person's Perspective on Heritage Preservation. Her essay, which discussed the responsibility that comes with inherited wealth and the importance of making history accessible to young people, was praised by scholars and educators. The publication established Emily as a serious young voice in the preservation community. David's speaking engagements evolved from simple success stories to more complex discussions about wealth, responsibility, and social justice. He spoke at business schools about ethical wealth management, at preservation conferences about community-centered restoration projects, and at philanthropic gatherings about the psychological and social challenges of sudden wealth. His authentic, thoughtful approach to these topics made him a sought-after speaker. The Lighthouse's educational programs expanded to include residencies for artists, writers, and scholars who wanted to study maritime heritage in an immersive environment. The residency program attracted participants from around the world, creating a vibrant intellectual community that enriched both the Lighthouse's educational mission and the cultural life of Grayport. Residents produced books, documentaries, artworks, and research projects that added to understanding of maritime history and culture. Emily's interaction with residency participants exposed her to diverse perspectives and methodologies for studying history. She learned from filmmakers how to use visual storytelling to make historical events more engaging, from writers how to craft compelling narratives about the past, and from artists how to interpret historical themes through creative expression. These experiences influenced her own approach to education and communication. The Lighthouse's role in marine safety continued to evolve with changes in technology and shipping patterns. David worked with maritime authorities to ensure that the Lighthouse's signal was properly integrated with GPS and other modern navigation systems. The facility also served as a weather monitoring station, providing data that helped predict dangerous conditions and warn mariners of potential hazards. The restoration of the Lighthouse's foghorn, a massive brass instrument that had been silent for decades, was one of Emily's favorite projects. She researched the horn's original specifications, tracked down craftsmen who could restore its mechanical components, and learned to operate the complex system of compressed air and resonating chambers that produced the Lighthouse's distinctive warning sound. The first test of the restored foghorn brought tears to the eyes of longtime Grayport residents who remembered its voice from their childhoods. The economic development initiatives funded by the Harlow Foundation began to show measurable results in improved quality of life throughout the region. Unemployment rates dropped, property values increased, and young people who had been leaving for opportunities elsewhere began staying in their home communities or returning after college. The Foundation's small business loan program helped launch dozens of new enterprises, from restaurants and shops to technology companies and artisan workshops. David's commitment to environmental stewardship led to several innovative projects that combined historical preservation with ecological restoration. The lighthouse grounds became a model for sustainable landscaping that used native plants and traditional techniques to prevent erosion while supporting local wildlife. Solar panels disguised as period-appropriate roof elements provided renewable energy without compromising the lighthouse's historical appearance. Emily's interest in marine biology developed alongside her passion for maritime history. She studied the ecosystem around the lighthouse, documenting changes in fish populations, seabird nesting patterns, and marine vegetation. Her research contributed to regional conservation efforts and earned recognition from environmental organizations. She learned that preserving historical structures was closely connected to protecting the natural environments they were part of. The lighthouse's library, housed in the visitor center, became a significant research collection focused on maritime history and lighthouse technology. David acquired rare books, manuscripts, and technical documents that supported serious scholarly research while also providing resources for the educational programs offered to visiting groups. The library attracted researchers from universities and museums around the world. As Emily entered her teenage years, she began to grapple more seriously with questions about her future and her responsibilities as heir to such significant wealth. She understood that she would eventually inherit not just money, but also the obligation to continue the charitable work that had become central to the family's identity. Rather than feeling burdened by this responsibility, she embraced it as an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to society. The lighthouse's guest quarters, originally intended for visiting researchers and dignitaries, evolved into a unique hospitality experience that combined luxury accommodations with educational programming. Guests could stay in beautifully appointed rooms while participating in lighthouse operations, learning about maritime history, and contributing to ongoing research projects. The program attracted visitors who wanted more than typical tourist experiences and generated revenue that supported the lighthouse's educational mission. David's approach to wealth management continued to emphasize long-term thinking and social responsibility. He established endowments that would ensure the lighthouse's preservation and educational programs could continue indefinitely, regardless of future economic conditions or changes in family circumstances. These endowments were structured to provide stable funding while allowing for growth and adaptation to changing needs. The success of the lighthouse restoration inspired David to take on increasingly ambitious preservation projects. His company began working on entire historic districts, coordinating the restoration of multiple buildings to create cohesive historical environments that could support heritage tourism and economic development. These district-level projects required collaboration with multiple property owners, local governments, and preservation organizations. Emily's role in these larger projects grew as her expertise and confidence increased. She became skilled at facilitating meetings between different stakeholders, explaining technical preservation concepts to non-experts, and building consensus around complex restoration plans. Her youth and obvious passion for the work helped her connect with people who might have been skeptical of preservation efforts led by adults with different priorities. The lighthouse's annual open house became a major regional event that attracted thousands of visitors over a long weekend. The event featured demonstrations of traditional maritime crafts, lectures by historians and archaeologists, guided tours of the lighthouse and visitor center, and opportunities to participate in ongoing research projects. Emily coordinated many aspects of the event, working with volunteers and staff to ensure that visitors had meaningful experiences while learning about maritime heritage. The open house also served as a fundraising event for the Harlow Foundation, generating resources that supported preservation projects and educational programs throughout the region. David was careful to ensure that the fundraising aspects of the event did not overshadow its educational mission, but the voluntary contributions from inspired visitors provided significant support for the Foundation's work. As the lighthouse story continued to inspire people around the world, David and Emily received thousands of letters from individuals facing their own challenges and looking for hope and guidance. Emily insisted on responding personally to letters from young people, sharing her perspective on overcoming adversity and finding purpose in life. These correspondences led to lasting friendships and mentoring relationships that enriched Emily's understanding of different life experiences. The lighthouse had become more than a historical structure or even a family home. It had evolved into a symbol of transformation and hope that resonated with people facing seemingly impossible circumstances. David and Emily's story proved that sometimes the things others mock or dismiss as worthless can contain the seeds of extraordinary transformation, and that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we choose to do with our opportunities and resources.